So share a visual with me for just a minute. For the first half of the 20th century, America was slowly, unevenly, but surely climbing a mountain. For the last 20 years, we've actually been descending on a path back down that mountain. And 2020 was like a steep fall along a hillside on that descending path. That mountain in its apex is economic, social, and health equity in America. Making progress again, climbing back up that mountain, getting past the detours and diversions, and to me is the greatest leadership challenge of the decade ahead. Leaders have not faced this kind of, not just inequity, but complexity in many, many decades. I believe there are 5 vital leadership traits that will make the difference in addressing those inequities in the decade ahead. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. So for me, this project kind of started with a wake-up call in 2018. I was working on a project related to poverty in America. I didn't have a book anywhere in my mind. I've worked in the social impact space for 20 plus years. I know about health disparities. I know about educational gaps. I know about racial inequities. I had been looking at individual snapshots, one inequity and one injustice at a time, sort of like those tiny frames in a photo mosaic, without stepping back to look at the whole picture and see what that full image looks like. When I finally did that, it wasn't just the scale and the scope. It was the pace and the downward path of economic, social, and health inequities that I saw. The gaps in economic and wealth disparities started in the 90s. They have just kept growing. The educational achievement gaps, which we were making progress on up till about 2005, have begun to widen again. And we think of access to health, we're making progress, but access to the quality of healthcare we could get in this country has continued to widen. Economic, social, and health inequity, to me, is the context for leadership in America today. So after that wake-up call for me in 2018, I started to ask myself, what kinds of leadership will get us back to climbing that mountain again? So I've been in this space for over 20 years, big organizations, small organizations, just about every cause you can think of. I've been in all 3 sectors. I started doing Venn diagrams. I was doing spreadsheets. I was writing on whiteboards. I was doing a ton of research. So let me share with you, I want to share just a couple slides tonight right now in sort of a quick bunch, because I'd rather keep my face on the camera talking to you guys. But I want to sort of ground us in a couple of quick concepts. So let me do that for just a minute here. So here's what I was looking for. The intersection of the best leaders I'd worked with, evidence of true social impact, and what did I think it'd take to meet the challenge of the decade ahead. That was the intersection I was looking for. And into that intersection is what I think are the 5 vital traits that are best tuned for the decade ahead. Here are these 5 traits. What I'm going to do is just give you a 1-sentence definition of each one of these, just so you've got the ideas and the concept grounded in your head. If you sort of remember those 3 circles and the gist of these 5 traits, you'll have the grounding for the rest of the conversation. So generosity mindset is a strategic focus on the ultimate goal, move past diversions. Leaders get the best from everyone. They make the whole greater than the parts. 24/7 authenticity is this relentless, persistent commitment to honesty, integrity, and personal accountability in short supply these days broadly. Data conviction. These are leaders that have a core belief that data is indispensable. It's strategic, not tactical. And these are people that possess the expert to not only use the data, but use it wisely. Capacity for complexity. Thinking in a non-linear, less sequential way to take in, make sense of, and act on new information constantly. By the way, women are better at complexity than men are. Last but not least, cross-sector fluency, which we're going to talk about tonight. These are leaders that have an ease and a natural movement across all three sectors in a very fluid, non-transactional way. I would love to, in the chat box, you're here to talk about leadership tonight. I'm telling you what I think are the most important traits for the decade ahead. What do you think the one or two are? Just throw them in the chat box. I always learn something, see something new I haven't seen before. And here's the two individuals we're going to talk about tonight and the two traits that I'm going to amplify tonight. One of them is 24/7 authenticity. That's Michael McAfee from Oakland. The other one's cross-sector fluency. That is Josh Becker from the Bay Area. I picked those two individuals because they're from the Bay Area. That's who I'm talking to mainly tonight. And I want to acknowledge something real quick, though, too. Josh, Michael, I mean, that's three guys on here at one time. That's not really reflective of the kinds of leadership I'm defining in the book, but just want to sort of call attention to that and acknowledge it. But those are the two traits and people we're going to talk with tonight. So in 2019, after I did that research, I started to have a story and a point of view that went along with that wake-up call and sense of growing inequity that I realized in 2018. I sort of started writing. And then 2020 happened. There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. That is a quote that's over a century old from Vladimir Lenin, strangely enough. Also very resonant today. There was more than 1 week when a decade happened in 2020. We all lived it. And that mountain I was talking about earlier that we were trying to climb, 2020 was that steep fall down a hillside on that path. The disparities in death rates for Black and brown people were 2 to 3 times the rest of the population. Women's careers were delayed and stalled sometimes by as much as a decade. The education gap is widening even further. We just don't even know how much yet. And this is important to know. Inequality is just one part of the challenge for American leaders in the decade ahead. We also have a divided, siloed America, unlike we've had in a long, long time. We have a technology divide and hypermedia that divides us in ways and deepens the silos that we experience. There is a blurring of the three sectors, public, private, nonprofit, like we haven't really ever seen before. It's opportunity. It's also complexity. There's a range of challenges that seem generational, historic. Climate, geopolitical, I could go on and on. Every one of those 5 vital traits I described a minute ago responds to these complexities. The world our leaders face is not just inequity, it's complexity. I used to be a high school basketball referee, and there was a game I refereed at the end of the first quarter. It was just this physical, gnarly, ugly game. And the veteran ref I was working with, I knew he could see the look on my face. He walked across the court at the timeout, and he looked at me and said, "Shoemaker, you have to referee the game you have, not the one you wish you had." Leaders today have to lead in the world we have, not the one we wish we had. But where we are today does not have to mean that's where we're going in the decade ahead. So at this point, this for me went from a wake-up call, an idea, and something I thought I might want to write about in 2018 to a point of view and something I thought I should write about in 2019. And frankly, in 2020, this sincerely became a passion and a project that I believed I had to write about, that had a genuine sense of urgency to it. As has always been the case and always will be the case, these times call for a new kind of leader. Civically active, socially conscious leaders in all three sectors, ready to define the leader they need to be for the decade ahead in an uneven, siloed America. I call these people rebuilders. I'll explain that in just a minute. So one of the 38 exemplars in the book, his name's Dan Cardinale. He said something to me when I was interviewing him for the book that I thought was particularly useful. I want to read it really briefly tonight. He was a jazz fan. And when I was talking to him, Dan said to me, the best jazz pianists are both technically good and creatively agile. Metaphorically, we have a lot of existing leaders who are technically proficient today, but not agile enough for tomorrow's complexity. They are still playing the same old tunes in the same old way. We need leaders that are tuned to the times. This isn't a matter of old leadership models all being broken. Every time and place through history has called upon different qualities and traits that are tuned to best meet the moment. Whenever I do this, I am so excited to share with you a couple leaders. And before I do that, I want to make one thing clear. This is not a leadership book about strategy or about teams or about culture, go on and on. I wrote a book about the kind of leaders that I think we have to reverse the inequities of America and begin our climb back up that mountain towards greater economic and social and health equity. And I believe there are leaders out there like that. And I believe those traits exist. So let me tell you a story of two of those people. Let me start with one of those complexities I described for the 2020s was, how do we deal with a deeply divided, siloed America and a technology divided hypermedia that loves to accentuate those differences and deepen those silos? To me, the trait that is best tuned to meet that challenge is what I call 24/7 authenticity. Michael McAfee is the CEO of Policy Link in Oakland. Their mission is to advance economic and racial equity. The definition for me of a leader that meets this quality is somebody that's worthy of belief. They're not false. They're true to their own spirit and character. It lives at the intersection of radical transparency meets this hypermedia world that we live in. I said this earlier. It's a relentless, persistent commitment to personal accountability and honesty. Edelman's a global communications firm. They do an annual trust barometer that's fairly well known. 2021, their report leads off this way. After a year of unprecedented turbulence, our 2021 trust barometer reveals a widespread mistrust of institutions and leaders. Adding to this is a failing trust ecosystem and a mandate to rebuild trust and chart a new path forward. 24/7 authenticity is about the need to be authentic before you have to be. It's about leaning in. Many of these folks, by the way, are grounded in some spirituality or faith, interestingly enough. The number one asset they deploy is trust. The first 24/7 leader in this book is Michael McAfee. Michael grew up in poverty in Oakland. This was his story he told me. What he lacked in economic assets, he made up for in parental and family assets. He said his examples of his parents' service to the community are examples that have never left his psyche. I'm a PK, a preacher's kid. He has 7 uncles that are preachers. And if you've ever heard Michael talk, that might not surprise you. When he took off for college, like a lot of us, he saw a bigger world that's out there, including the world of wealth and power. And he decided early on he wanted to understand it and he wanted to someday influence it. His first job, he went to work for a foundation. They deployed into a youth development organization. After a while, what he saw there were the same kinds of inequities he saw when he was growing up. That wasn't right. That wasn't okay with him. So he went back to his bosses and his sponsors and he said, things are broken. They aren't working right. Well, that wasn't what they wanted to hear. So in his words, Michael went from being a rising star to an angry black man. They sent him to anger management training, which is kind of hard to fathom. So this 24/7 authenticity, it does have trade-offs. One of the things I asked a lot of people, including Michael, as I said, are there any sort of like guiding principles that show you the way, particularly when things are tough? Michael gave me 3. Does being truly authentic bring me joy? Who are you accountable to and what are you ultimately working for? Never forget that. And it matters to be around money and power. Always try to influence for the good, but never let it own you. We can accept the world as it is, or we can find up and we can build up more leaders, rebuilders with 24/7 authenticity like Michael McAfee. One more story, and we'll talk about this trait real time in just a minute. So how do we deal with the complexity of a divided silo of citizenship but with all three of our sectors blurring together like never before, especially in 2020. Again, it's an opportunity. It's also complexity. The trade to me that's best tuned to meet that moment is cross-sector fluency. The dictionary definition is helpful here. Gracefulness and ease of movement. Our challenges today, they do not exist in silos. They cut across sectors. A generation ago, all three sectors could sort of hang out, stay in their own silos, pay attention to what's going on over here. Those days are long gone. A cross-sector fluent rebuilder is the glue person that brings things together. They have a wider lens. They see more holistic solutions. They have a broader set of experiences. They show up this way. It's not transactional. It's not episodic. It's not someone they trot out for the community event, It's someone that's fluent and can do this every day. A generation ago, cross-sector fluent leaders were a nice to have. I believe they're now a must have. In 2020, we saw private sector CEOs show up in ways we never have before. I just finished a project with Michael and Policy Link where we were looking at the state of racial equity in corporate America. Time and time again, unprompted, what CEOs said to me was the number one thing they had learned to do in 2020 was to listen. I wouldn't have heard that before 2020. One of the cross-sector fluent leaders in that book is Josh Beckert. I met him about 20 years ago. We'll talk to him in just a minute. I also did a podcast, by the way, in association with this. One of those cross-sector fluent leaders on there is Michelle Nunn. She could absolutely teach a masterclass in cross-sector fluency. At the end of the day, this book in this hour, it isn't about me. It isn't even about Josh. It's about each of us. Ready to define the leaders we need to be in the most complex and equitable America in nearly 100 years. The title of the book, Taking Charge of Change, it speaks to facing the times, not waiting, about being proactive. And I wrote about 38 rebuilders in this book, not just because they're great leaders. I wanted to give enough examples so everybody that read it could see themselves in some of those leaders. And I don't want folks to just read this and think about it. I want them to act on it. Think about yourself and how you evaluate yourself. And I know the muscle I need to build. Look at your teams. Where are you strong? Where are you weak? Look at your organization. How can you be more resilient? I'm asking each of us to ask ourselves,